All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really unusual, deeply personal, and frankly just completely captivating digital archive straight from B magazine. Specifically, we're looking at a piece of documentation called 7 Months of Exile and Emergence. And guys, this document totally blurs the line between a raw, boots-on-the-ground survival diary and high-concept sci-fi lore. It's essentially a masterclass in how someone can take profound personal trauma and translate it into this massive cosmic narrative.
And you know, the creator actually spells this out right from the jump. In the official disclaimer, the text boldly frames itself as a mythic infrastructure, cinematic indictment, and sovereign broadcast. So right away, that specific language tells us we aren't just reading a standard blog post or some ordinary journal entry. We're stepping into a heavily stylized, deliberately constructed space that practically demands we read between the lines. To really wrap our heads around that space, we've got to talk about what the archive calls sovereign diagnostics. The creator claims absolutely zero affiliation with any governments, intelligence agencies, or activist groups. Instead, all of its content, the interpretations, the glyphs, the collapse protocols, are positioned purely as diagnostic tools. Their stated goal? To expose things like systemic erosion and ritualized containment, rather than making any sort of traditional political endorsement. It's a completely unique analytical framework for looking at societal breakdown.
To make sense of all this dense material, our roadmap for this explainer is straightforward. First, the sovereign broadcast, followed by the 7 Months of Exile, then global emergence and refuge, and finally, the Echo Rift mythos. Starting off with Section 1, the sovereign broadcast.
So, whose brainchild is all of this? The site, along with this wild concept of the Cosmic University of Echo Rift Studies, IX, was founded by a Dr. Melvin Sewell. It's such a fascinating mix, isn't it? On one hand, you have these very grounded, traditional academic and corporate titles, M.Sc, Ph.D., CEO, academic dean. But then, they're placed right next to highly abstract, multiversal roles like diagnostic architect. It really sets a tone of rigorous, almost clinical authority over incredibly surreal subject matter.
Moving on to Section 2, 7 Months of Exile.
Now we're looking at the physical reality of this case study. It's a super specific 7-month window starting in late 2025. It maps out a journey from exposure on the California coast across the Pacific to Hawaii, then leaps into a month-long Asian tour before finally landing in a sanctuary in Vietnam by May 2026. Keep this timeline in your head because the contrast between day 1 and day 200 is staggering.
Let's zero in on that very first location, Malibu, California, November 2025. Now, to be clear, this was absolutely not a vacation. Actually, it was a forced retreat into the elements. The archive states the subject was living in a tent on the edge of Malibu for a month, pushed into pure survival mode by discrimination and persecution. It's an incredibly harsh, vulnerable starting point.
From there, the documentation follows the subject straight across the ocean to Kauai, Hawaii. And things, well, they definitely don't get easier. From December 2025 all the way to March 2026, the forest canopy became home. The archive describes this tent as a fragile shelter against relentless hostility. Just think about that for a second. 5 whole months out in the elements, relying on literally just a piece of fabric to keep you safe.
And the source material doesn't hold back on what that hostility looked like. Treating this strictly as a logged testimony, the text details severe environmental and systemic threats. The subject reports prowling white supremacists and even a corrupt police force that actually compounded the danger rather than providing safety. When you view this through that sovereign diagnostic framework we talked about earlier, these extreme conditions act as raw data points proving the systemic erosion Dr. Sewell is talking about.
Which brings us to Section 3, Global Emergence and Refuge.
So, after squaring away a repatriation loan and finally securing a passport, everything accelerates. We see a massive, rapid shift in geography. A single night in Tokyo, a week in Shanghai, 3 weeks in Bangkok. The text notes that each of these cities offered a brief glimpse of freedom. The subject is no longer static beneath a forest canopy, they are quite literally on the move.
And by May 2026 in Ho Chi Minh City, the contrast is just night and day. On one side you have exile, tents, exposure to the elements, hostility, pure survival mode. On the other side, emergence, a fully furnished apartment, total privacy, and the incredibly specific, beautifully mundane act of eating a seafood pancake without fear. The source material really highlights this as the first time the subject had a space that was completely unshared and undeniably their own.
The archive actually wraps up this whole physical timeline with a pretty powerful thought. This 7-month odyssey is more than a travelogue. It is a testimony of survival against systemic oppression, ending in a reclamation of humanity. It's not just a log of moving from point A to point B, it's framed as a deeply hard-fought battle to reclaim basic human dignity.
And that perfectly sets up Section 4, the Echo Rift Mythos.
Because literally right after that heavy, very real reflection on surviving, the archive just drops this text. Chapter 1, Origin. Boom. Just like that, without any warning whatsoever, we are completely yanked out of the real world and thrust right back into the esoteric lore of the cosmic university. It's a totally jarring structural choice, but it brilliantly forces you to readjust your perspective on the fly. And here is where the lore just goes full throttle. We're introduced to this figure, Psycho Venga, who supposedly emerges from the rift born between slip flow and counterflow, marked by SH1 resonance. This directly slams incredibly heavy, abstract sci-fi terminology right up against the visceral, earthly survival story we just tracked in Malibu and Hawaii. It takes the idea of emergence we saw in Ho Chi Minh City and scales it up to a multiversal event.
So, that leaves us staring at one massive question. How exactly does a visceral, deeply physical 7-month struggle for survival directly translate into the multiversal emergence of Psycho Venga and this mysterious SH1 resonance? It's a fascinating puzzle. How does the sheer trauma of living in a tent and the eventual relief of a quiet apartment serve as the true emotional bedrock for this vast mythic infrastructure? It kind of makes you realize that the deepest sci-fi concepts here are actually built from the rawest human realities. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always look for the story behind the myth.